Hi, and welcome to the Luminaries In and Out of Sect podcast, a show about the moon and how astrologers embody and relate to it. My name is SP Hall, and I'm your host. Today we are doing something a little bit different. So this is a mini-series entitled What Makes an Astrologer, which came about as a result of the comments that Rob Hand made on a recent Astrology Podcast episode about significations in the birth chart of a professional astrologer. The link to this episode is in the show notes. Therein, Rob Hand makes a bit of an offhand comment saying, "The 11th sign from the lot of fortune is a place of acquisition. People," and here he's referring to Project Hindsight, "started looking at their charts, and an awful lot of people had one of the following things true. The lot of fortune was in a sign ruled by Mercury, or Mercury was in the sign of the lot of fortune. Or those same two conditions applied to the place of acquisition, which is the 11th sign from the lot of fortune. And to this day, if I don't find that in a person's chart, I wonder about their credentials as an astrologer. This is for making money by astrology, by the way. It's not for studying it. All you need to study astrology is a good, solid Mercury." In the wake of this episode, there was some commentary about this quote on social media. Being curious about what Hand said myself, I put out a tweet thread looking at these conditions in 5 professional astrologers' charts. And in one way or another, all 5 of these people met Hand's criteria. I've put a link to that tweet thread in the show notes for your reference. In response to that, Michelle, who is Astrospection on Twitter, shared a database of famous astrologers from astroseek.com with me and encouraged me to do more research into this subject. I was reticent, but Mo, who is Astral Tour on Twitter, told me that she'd help me carry out a research project looking at Hand's criteria in famous and or professional astrologers' charts. Mo and I ended up looking at about 90 charts of historical famous astrologers and received input from about 40 contemporary professional astrologers through a Google Form survey. In this series, I will speak with 5 astrologers and thinkers: Cameron Allen, Daniel Norman, Amy Green, Dorje Kirsten, and Ali A. Olomi, about their thoughts on Rob Hand's comments and other significations they identify in the birth chart that may point to remuneration from astrology. The series will culminate in a conversation between Mo and I, where we discuss our research and the conclusions that we've drawn from it. In addition, I plan to release an article on my website after the series airs where I summarize our findings and the thoughts of my guests in this series. Please be sure to subscribe to my website for updates, which is linked in the show notes below. Now for my third conversation of this series with the thought-provoking astrologer Dorje Kirsten of Heart Astrology. Here's a bit more about Dorje from his bio on his website, which I've linked in the show notes. Dorje was certified as a medieval astrologer in 2011. He is a professional astrologer who offers a variety of services to personal clients. His method of reading the chart is a blend of classical techniques and modern interpretations, a culmination of 30 years of study. For 20 years, he has been reading charts professionally using traditional astrology techniques learned from experience and studying courses from such luminaries as Robert Zoller, Robert Hand, Bernadette Brady, and Joseph Crane. Speaking on his training as an astrologer, Dorje said, "I think it's important that anyone giving professional readings certifies from a successful teacher and has mindfulness or therapy training of some sort under their belt." In this episode, we talk about the importance of defining what it means to be an astrologer, the difficulties inherent therein, and the boundaries of the label professional astrologer. In that vein, I experienced a number of synchronicities while working on this series. During this time, I listened to 2 older Astrology Podcast episodes that spoke directly to topics related with this series, and especially what we focus on today. The first episode was a conversation between Chris Brennan, Eugenia Kroc, and Adam Sommer. Therein, Chris Brennan speaks to how many professional astrologers make their coin. Given that episode aired a few years ago, I reached out to Chris to see if his opinion on the matter had changed at all. And this is what he shared with me. Quote, "I have a broad definition of what it means to be an astrologer, and I classify a lot of people as astrologers even if it isn't their primary vocation. To me, a person is an astrologer if they 1. Believe that astrology is a legitimate phenomenon, 2. Have studied the subject and become proficient in it, and 3. Regularly apply it in their everyday life. I think what I was saying in that episode is that most people that I consider to be astrologers don't necessarily do that as their primary professions, or don't do it as their only job. and the ones that do make astrology their primary profession often create multiple income streams through consultations, teaching, writing, etc. End quote. The second episode that I want to mention was touched upon a number of times in my conversation with Dorje. There's a quote from Christopher Warnock in the Astrology Podcast episode on the Picatrix from around 2 hours and 19 minutes in. I reached out to Christopher to make sure that he was okay with me quoting him here, and he wanted me to let you know that, quote, "It's fine to quote me, and I would add that I have supported myself, my wife, and my cat very comfortably as an astrologer for many years, and I have none of the conditions for making money as an astrologer cited by Rob Hand." End quote. In commenting on his and Chris Brennan's shared Aquarius rising and moon, Warnock says, quote, "One of the signatures that I think for astrologers or any fortune teller, it's not unusual to have an angular moon or a dignified moon because of that intuition. I was going to Japan and doing a lot of these mini readings, and the Japanese do have a lot of fortune telling. It's much more acceptable. And it's amazing how many of those people have prominent moons. And Mercury too. A strong Mercury is also a signature. And then you have people that don't fit it at all. That's what's funny, is that you'll have somebody who's a great astrologer and they'll have none of that stuff at all. It's one of those things of being careful of making any 100% statements about any one indication." End quote. In addition to talking about the moon and the charts of astrologers, Dorje and I also talk about the roles that Venus and Jupiter may play, and get into Stoicism versus Theurgy, especially as it relates to the very purpose of astrology. It was a really rich, informative conversation. Thanks again for joining me, Dorje. Please be sure to check out the links to Dorje's website and socials below, as well as links to some of the resources that we touched on in our conversation. All right, Dorje, thank you so much for being with me today and for sharing your thoughts on this topic. So I just wanted to start by asking or pointing out that you wrote a blog post or an article on your website about Rob Hand's statement about astrologers and placements in the chart that show whether an astrologer will be able to make money doing so, for lack of a better definition. And I was interested to see that you had a consult with Rob Hand and he brought that up. And I was just wondering if you could talk about that experience and if there was anything he brought up around that differed from what he brought up in the Astrology Podcast conversation.
Excellent. First of all, thank you for having me, SP. I really appreciate being here. Yeah, I did have a reading with Rob Hand about 3 months before he brought that up in the Astrology Podcast conversation. And so I was a little bit surprised. In the reading, we were talking about several potential career options that I was looking at, and one of which was an astrologer, and another one was coding, software engineering. And I was applying for a job at that point in time in software engineering, and I was like, well, but maybe I've been doing astrology as a professional for 20 years, but I've never gone in full bore, and what do you think? And he brought up that at Project Hindsight, that they had found this kind of like formula where if the part of fortune was in a mercurial ruled sign or with Mercury, or the 11th from the part of fortune was in a mercurial ruled sign or with Mercury, that was indicative of someone who could make a living being an astrologer. That the universe would work for that. And but then my chart doesn't have it. And so he's like, well, maybe that's not, the best thing for you. And then he said, but you do have like an exalted Mercury. I have Mercury in Virgo, and it's, in the terms of Virgo. So it's like max,
Right.
it's max points according to the medieval technique that you could apply to it. So he looked at that and he's like, well, but you got this going on. And then I also do have the moon exactly conjunct midheaven. Which also can indicate an astrologer. And then I have Alphica. Alphica is conjunct my part of spirit, or the lot of the daemon, which also can indicate an astrologer. So when I heard him say that in the podcast, I was like, oh, that sounds very definitive.
Right.
That sounds like an absolute.
Yeah.
And yet there's all these other aspects that can then be given to what would make an astrologer.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what spurred me on to write something about it, because I feel like when you look at astrology, you get these formulas, which are called aphorisms.
Right.
And if A plus B plus C is true, if A plus B equals C is true, then this is, something that can happen.
Mm-hmm.
And I looked at that and I was like, well, this aphorism does seem to be true, because if you pause and go and look at a number of charts of successful astrologers, some high percentage of them do have that aspect. They do have that aphorism as true.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's a percentage that don't.
Right.
And that percentage that does not, they also seem to have given to the crowd and
Mm-hmm.
seem to have successfully been consulting astrologers or
Right.
people throughout their life.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wanted to put out this, like, something that said, like, hey, this is true and it may make it easier. But at the same time, that's not the entire definition of whether you can be an astrologer or not.
Right. Yeah. I think that it might be helpful too to talk a little bit about your experience professionally as an astrologer, just to get some clarity on that. Yeah. Can you give us like a brief introduction to yourself and your practice?
So I lived at a Tibetan Buddhist retreat center for 13 years, and really full-time volunteer. I dropped out of college to go there and became, relatively successful within that work. I was flown around the world. I was, teaching in Asia how to set up and do Tibetan Buddhist empowerments and shrines, which was kind of crazy.
Cool.
Here I am, right? Here I was, like a little white beatnik guy being flown to Asia,
Uh-huh.
to teach how to be a shrine keeper for the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. But I have Venus in fall, ruling my fifth house.
Mm.
And one of the things I kept doing was having children. And, as you might imagine, it's extremely hard to live as a full-time volunteer once you have a number of children.
Right.
So my life circumstances eventually made it so I had to leave, and I had sacrificed my formative career and professional years, and I had to volunteering. I had dropped out of college, and as I was leaving, one of my teachers, Lama Jime Norbu, just an exalted, exceptional human,
Mm.
exceptional meditator. And he said, "Well, when you leave, I want you to be an astrologer."
Oh,
Because
wow.
being an astrologer, you can take the wisdom that you've garnered through your years and you can, like, express it and connect with other humans.
Mm.
And so then I left and, I went, he was like, hang your shingle as an astrologer. I went and I hung my shingle out as an astrologer, and I started doing readings pretty much entirely based on the Fidaria and whole sign houses. And so I'd go through the chart and I'd look at the Fidaria and I'd make predictions about what had happened in your life and what was going to come in your life. And if the birth time was accurate, it was always just spot on, which just
Mm.
stunned me. It just really stunned me, because I was like, oh, this is like one simple technique, and
Mm-hmm.
yet it's enough to provide a 90-minute consultation that people feel rewarded coming to. And so then I did that. Then my current wife got pregnant and it was twins.
Mm-hmm.
And this was like, oh gosh, 2000, like, I think 11, 2012. No, well, 2010. The twins were born in 2008. But by 2010, she was like, you know what? I want you to, like, do something else.
Mm.
So we bought a tea company, which I ran, like, not entirely successfully, because at the heart I'm kind of like an esoteric meditator. So
Uh-huh.
I just don't have that, like, capitalist drive in me.
Yeah.
Um, but while doing that, I still gave astrology,
Oh,
and
cool.
I've given astrology readings, continuously without putting a lot of effort into developing it as a sole professional career since 2006,
Mm-hmm.
when I left.
Yeah.
And right now I'm currently gearing up and engaging more in the community and in the practice. and more as a professionally because I'm finding it extremely rewarding personally.
Mm.
And so that's where I'm coming from, and that's kind of been the arc of my own astrological practice.
Yeah, that's so cool. What a amazing journey you've been on. It's super, yeah, it feels inspirational to me almost, like doing astrology even part-time for 20 years and traveling internationally, doing this really cool thing and owning a tea company. It's like me, it's probably the Sag rising in me that's like, ooh, living so many different lives. It feels exciting. Cool. Thanks for sharing that. And it's interesting because I feel like it brings up this interesting point about what does it mean to be a professional astrologer? What does it mean to make money as an astrologer? That's one of the downsides of the research, or not the downsides, but one of the weaknesses of the research that Mo and I are doing is that we have a list of like all these famous astrologers, but some people, while they had a strong astrological influence, maybe that wasn't their main job. Maybe they were a software designer or a software engineer on the side, or maybe they, were a musician, something like that. Like it's hard to say what it means. Like, does it only have to be you work full time as an astrologer and make all your money from astrology, or is it like you can do what you're doing where you're working part time for 20 years giving readings and you're making money? So it's kind of hard to, and it's also, we don't know anybody's financial situation really. It's hard to say definitively like, oh, okay, this person is in a good financial shape or not, because like we don't have, I don't have the receipts for that. So I was just curious if you had any thoughts, additional thoughts on that.
I think that is an extraordinary question, and really to the point of delineating it, what it is to be an astrologer. The nature of being an astrologer, because it's not a professionalized solar business,
Mm.
it's more of a lunar business.
Mm-hmm.
It's very evasive what an astrologer actually is. I mean, an astrologer is one who practices the knowledge of the stars. And that's very simple. But with the definition that broad, anybody could be an astrologer,
Right.
you know.
And Hand kind
Uh,
of addresses that by saying that like all you need to be a student of astrology or an astrologer is to have a Mercury. Do you feel like that kind of speaks to that, or are you saying something different?
yeah, I do feel like it speaks to that. And I think, part of it is that it's so broad. Like you have human design astrologers. Are they astrologers? I mean, they're
Mm-hmm.
really doing something unique and different if they are. And are Uranian astrologers is like
Mm.
from the medieval perspective, are modern psychological astrologers because they're I mean, if you listen to the astrology podcast, you've heard a number of debates from, the modern psychological astrologers on the harm of doing predictive work.
Right.
But from a medieval astrologer's perspective, that's part of the entire point is to help
Absolutely.
forearm people to understand what's coming in their life and give them some sense of either stoic acceptance
Mm-hmm.
or theurgic capacity
Right.
to alter not what is coming, but how it manifests,
Right.
you know. And so then I couldn't even begin to give a definition of what would make a hard absolute term for what a professional astrologer is.
Mm-hmm.
There are astrologers who just deal with market trading. They're
Right.
not giving. They're absolutely not like giving emotional, mythological context to people to help them live enriched and fulfilling lives.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and for me, as an astrologer, that's what I feel like I am. Like my goal is to help someone live an enriched, fulfilling, mythological life that they feel has meaning to them.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that market astrologer isn't an astrologer.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that the research astrologer isn't an astrologer.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't mean, that it doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that the person who's writing pop sun sign astrology or rising sign astrology for Vice magazine isn't an astrologer.
Right.
Um, And so I think that's the point of the question is like,
Right.
if we're going to say that this particular formula makes an astrologer, then maybe part of what we have to do is define what an astrologer is. We have
Hmm.
to have a definition that we can work with.
Right.
Because if you're like, if you're a pop astrologer, then it's quite possible that really what you need to have is like Venus
Hmm.
exalted,
Hmm.
so that you can bring a sense of pleasure and fashion to the people who are reading the astrology,
Yeah.
or if you're a market astrologer, maybe it's really important that you have like Saturn in good condition
Hmm.
so that you know how to like, do stop losses and like prevent, downswings from when you make a right call. Because again, astrology is whether it's market astrology or whether it's predictive astrology, it's playing odds and percentage.
Yeah.
Like X will happen if 90% of the time or 60% of the time, or, like 65% of the time, a kid is born with Mars conjunct the midheaven. Then ruling the first, then he could be a great athlete, right?
Hmm.
But then there's a percentage who's not. Like you and I
Right.
were talking about Tom Brady online the other day,
Yep.
and I went and I looked at Tom Brady's chart, and he actually has the markings of an astrologer according to this formula.
Mm.
That and I was like, well, is Tom Brady an astrologer? Maybe like we wouldn't know. Maybe he's personally
Yeah.
doing that in the background.
Seems
But
like his wife
I
maybe might be,
yeah, maybe his
or
wife
his
was. Yeah,
ex-wife rather. Yeah.
yeah. So I just think that's absolutely to the question. Is what is an astrologer, and how do you define that? How do you define it?
That's a great question. I mean, I feel I want to say like going into this research and even doing this podcast episode, my my impulse I feel like is to, if anything, want to prove Rob Hand wrong or to point holes uh in the statement, because it felt one like off the cuff, and so it's kind of like, should I even be focusing so much energy on this? Like, this person just said this off the cuff, and so it was interesting to talk to you and hear that same kind of thing came up in consultation. But it's like, as a relatively new student of astrology as well, I'm just kind of like, I want to learn as much as I can, or I want to learn from this to see if the statement is true. And so I don't know if I necessarily like have a definition that I can give, but I do feel like, yeah, there must be a multiplicity of ways that what makes an astrologer. I feel like I'm thinking of calling this episode like what makes an astrologer, to kind of talk about uh touch on the fate free will thing of it as well. And because it's like something in your chart you can't necessarily change. Yeah, I don't quite know. So it's hard to say. And I would like to talk about kind of more of what you found um, in relation to the different criteria that you lay out in the article. So do you mind kind of like walking us through that a little bit?
Sure. So initially, I put forth, well, the Robert Hant criteria is not his criteria, but the criteria they say they discovered. And I don't know if it came from Balance or who it came from. But Project Hindsight discovered that this was, indeed the case. And then I was like, well, what's the logic behind this?
Mm-hmm.
And then the logic is that astrology is a hermetic art.
Right.
It was, traditionally, like if you go and you read the mythologies, and I can't quote you an exact source, but I know I read it more than once, that Hermes gave astrology to humanity.
Right.
And so then I was like, okay, so then if you have the lot of fortune, then what you have there is you have what you are born with, what your fated birthright is.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was like, but we also have this lot of spirit, which you said Ali Alomi brought up. And the lot of spirit is what you make of your life. It's
Right.
like what your soul, what your daemon wants to manifest. So you're
Mm-hmm.
born into condition, and then your lot of daemon is like, what am I manifesting into the world?
Mm-hmm.
What is my function to manifest in this world, for better or for worse?
Right.
Because there is some like, how much can everybody manifest the truth of their spirit? But so then I was like, so then probably if you have the lot of spirit in a Gemini ruled sign, or if you have the lot of spirit 11th from a Gemini ruled sign,
Mm-hmm.
then you could be an astrologer too. But
Mm-hmm.
you earn it. It doesn't come naturally. You earn it. And one of the things I have noticed is that the people who have the part of fortune under those circumstances seem to be naturally really good at it. And I'm really kind of jealous at them because I feel like I struggle really hard to be good at it, you know?
Yeah.
And I looked at my chart and I do have a lot of spirit under those conditions, you know? So I'm like,
Interesting.
oh, well, there you go. And then as you mentioned earlier, like Warnock was like, oh, well, the moon on the angle in the solar too. And that made sense to me. I do think I remember reading once in Hermes Trimester, this is Libra astrology, that the moon also signifies astrologers. But that book mysteriously disappeared from my bookshelf about 15 years ago when I had a bunch of guests over. So I was not able to double check the source.
Okay.
But I do believe I remember that. Then, so maybe the moon's indicative of too. And then I started contemplating that a lot of astrologers really play the role of counselor
Mm,
or advisor
right.
more than their technical capacity to delineate certain points in a chart with 100% accuracy and make predictions based off of those.
Mm-hmm.
They are someone that people go to feel okay about their life,
Yeah.
and to seek answers with like, why is this happening, and how can I make the best use of it? And once you enter that realm, you're not entering the realm of Hermes. You're entering the realm more of, yeah, a counselor or a therapist or a priestcraft, like someone that people go to in order to feel good about who they are.
Right.
And again, to me, this like goes back to like we're in need of mythological support these days. We as a
Mm,
society have come into such an experience of nihilism. Like,
yes.
religion is like rapidly falling away from at least the American society
Mm-hmm.
standpoint of what people believe in. Like the number of people who believe in God is way down. We
Yeah.
live in a social media world where like capitalism runs amok and everything is like mediated corporate ideals that nobody can ever actually truly buy into because they're not there for us to achieve it. They're there for us to keep spending into it. And all of
Yeah.
this creates a tremendous sense of nihilism in our own heart.
Mm,
And that nihilism, I believe, is antidoted in a non-sectarian way through astrology and its myths. Like
mm.
I can be a materialist, I could be a nihilist, I could be a Catholic, I could be a Muslim, I could be any tradition. And there's this common language of astrology that provides myths to live by.
Right.
And myths to live by is Jupiterian in context.
Mm,
I'm like,
yes.
well, then there's also this Jupiter angle into what an astrologer could be doing.
Right.
And so then for me, it's like coming back to what is an astrologer, since we don't have um, regulatory bodies that have clamped down and created solid definitions that everybody has agreed to.
Mm-hmm.
What is an astrologer is wide open still.
Yeah.
I don't know if it will be in 20 years or 30 years as more and more brilliant minds like yourself and, like even exalted minds like Chris Benner continue to try to define what it is.
Yeah.
Um, but it seems like we're moving more and more into like threshing out the shaft so we get the real solid wheat of what is this profession and how to judge whether one is good at it and to have the tools to be really good at it.
Mm-hmm.
So then, from that perspective, like maybe it's going to move more towards like you have to have these significations and this way of approaching thinking to be an astrologer. But right now, it still seems to me like it's just a wide open field. And
Yeah.
people who have like a strong Jupiter and faith-based drive can do astrology for people, or they can inform people through astrology,
Mm-hmm.
even if their Mercury is not ideal. That being said, like once you have a lot of spirit in a Mercury sign or with Mercury or 11th from Mercury or with Mercury or a lot of fortune, at that point you're hitting about 30 or 40% of charts, or maybe
Right.
20%, you know,
Yeah.
and so that, that's a big, big net at that point.
Right. Yeah. It does get a little bit, what's the word for it? It becomes kind of, yeah, unspecific, a bit broadly encompassing. And again, it's like if we come to a place where there's a kind of astrological body that's saying like you need to have this or that placement to be a good astrologer, all it takes is, one person or a few people to say like, I don't have that. Watch me be successful. So
That's true.
it's like who is to say? Yeah, I I feel like that kind of covers it. Do you have any additional thoughts that you want to add before we wap up?
No, I just, really appreciate that you're doing this because I feel like the exploration of the topic
Hmm.
is illuminating. And the one thing that I'm really just appreciating now, because I've never seen it in my years of studying astrology, is the last few years when there are so many people willing to engage in these conversations. It's
Yeah.
like it seems incredibly developmental, and every day, like I log on to social media and connect with astrologers who've been practicing for 3 months or astrologers who've been practicing for 20 years. I feel like I'm learning something.
Yeah.
And maybe that's mercurial, that sense of always learning.
Hmm.
Um, maybe that is part of what will make a good astrologer because it absolutely seems like a craft that one never masters but always studies.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important when we come into talking about astrology, we're talking with, I mean, I don't have that much client experience actually. I've done a few like trades and consultations here and there, but bringing some humility into it because this is a thousands, millennia year old tradition that we can't embody or learn in totality in just a few years or maybe even a few decades of study. So
Yeah,
I think that that's really, really important to bring to the table as well.
yeah, and I think you mentioned earlier, and it does serve the point is that AI is very quickly going to do all of the delineations for us.
Hmm.
And so what is an astrologer might change in the near future to
Yeah.
being more about humanistic, the ability to present the information in a humanistic way.
Yeah.
Again, so that someone finds fulfillment through the information rather than just sees it.
Yeah. And I'm reminded of like this differentiation between knowledge or intelligence and wisdom.
Mm.
You can have all the information and be able to regurgitate that, but I feel like there's wisdom in knowing what information to emphasize when, knowing what questions to ask. And I feel like that could be maybe I'm wrong. I see AI as a real threat in a lot of ways to human livelihood in general.
Oh yeah,
But it's
yeah,
kind of like, yeah, an astrologer can help sift through the myriad of information that an AI can give and be like, actually, this is the thing that is probably important. This thing is less important.
hmm
But I don't know.
hmm
Maybe I'm wrong with that. Maybe an AI could become a very good at discerning what is actually relevant information for a person and what isn't.
right, yeah.
Yeah.
Have you heard about how Rob talking a lot now about how astrology is a theurgic practice?
No, I have not.
Yeah,
But
it's
I'm
kind of
very interested
interesting.
in this topic actually because I've been like looking into the kind of master the nativity technique and like I'm
Uh-huh.
really interested in this idea of like astrology as the study of kind of fate and free will and finding that place in between the edges of fate where we do have some autonomy to change things like what's the shape and the color of that and I think that
Brilliant,
yeah, I think
brilliant.
theurgy really talks about that. And it's kind of like, there's a big conversation right now about like relational astrology. And I don't
Hmm
think that relational astrology is a thing that we would even be talking about if there wasn't some way that we could navigate our fates in some little ways. It's like why develop
Yeah, it's
relationships with planets if it doesn't matter what we do? You know,
by
I
relational astrology, you mean with planets, or do you mean with two people coming together? Do they fit?
Relational astrology, I mean more along the lines, and like, I might not define it the best way, but there are a few people who kind of like, Palace Augustine, Diana Rose Harper, there's a few other
Hmm
people. It's more of like relating to planets and astrological
I see.
bodies in
Yeah,
kind of a relational way rather than what's the relationship between two people and their
yeah,
synastry.
I see. I see. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's brilliant. I mean, I love that kind of idea. Does that then presuppose that planetary bodies have their own consciousness or intellect, and that by engaging with their intellect, we can actually have conversation?
Yeah, I
Is
mean,
that where they're coming from?
I don't want to speak for them, but my understanding, I feel like intellect is a difficult word, but like I think it does presuppose that planets are beings,
Right.
with their own kinds of autonomy and ability to relate and engage and, what have you.
Yeah. Yeah. It is a form of theurgy then. Yeah.
Yeah,
Or an animistic theurgy on
right.
a very grand scale.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I would fall in that line with how I think. Although I would tend to think that planetary bodies don't cast their eyes upon individual mortal.
Mm,
However, the energies that they're putting forth, we have negotiation on how we receive them and work with them.
yeah.
And, like one thing I might say to a client is like, oh, you're having a Mars conjunct Uranus, like go really hit the gym hard,
Hmm.
or this could manifest as an auto accident. Like
Right.
you have negotiation with how that energy is occurring.
Right.
And is that negotiation enhanced? I mean, to me, that is theurgy. That is a
Right.
theurgic right. Like if you're giving a reading and you're like, yes, this energy is coming into your life, how can you uplift it
Hmm.
for the betterment of your soul and your body and your mind?
Right.
That is a form of theurgy. But is it enhanced then by engaging in, the Orphic hymn rites and like
Hmm.
supplicating personally those planets? Or putting on gemstones that were like put into a ring at a certain point in time in order to create an affinity for that planet.
Yeah.
Um, it seems to me like it is. I
I,
mean,
I
if
have
not,
one.
there's a lot of placebo sales going on.
Right. Right. I have a question for you that I'm interested in, especially with your history of meditation, because I think that for me, with the study or with the question of like astrology and fate and free will, and you brought up stoicism and like studying astrology. Chris Brennan will talk about like studying astrology so you have some knowledge of things that will happen in the future and you can kind of develop this stoic indifference, for lack of a better term, to it.
Hmm.
And for me and my understanding of stoicism, it almost feels like if that's the nature of reality, studying astrology, like we would be better suited to developing a meditation practice,
Hmm.
rather than studying astrology and knowing what's going to happen. Because the highest goal for life would be developing equanimity rather than
Hmm.
developing kind of some kind of knowledge of the stars and how their spinning affects our lives. I'm not sure if you have any opinion on that, but
I feel like, yeah, gaining equanimity is absolutely important, as a human being. I do feel like the study of astrology, like I think even Ezra, what his book, The Beginning of Wisdom,
mm,
is like I've interpreted it as being exactly what you're speaking of here, that through the study of astrology, you gain the wisdom of acceptance of the will of God.
mm,
Um, However, I'm not entirely on the side of fate,
yeah,
um, nor am I entirely on the side of free will. Again, I think it falls more into a theurgic perspective of there is some negotiation of the energies that you can do.
right,
And I feel that way because I've seen it at work.
mm,
I've seen it work for clients, where they have really just turned things around by putting their mind into, and this maybe comes full circle, putting their mind into the path that they are most fulfilled on by the delineation of the chart.
mm,
They then start experiencing a smoother life than they were.
mm,
And I think that can fall back into the idea of the lot of the daemon, or the daemon, the holy guardian daemon. If you're aligned with that, then your life tends to start going smoother.
yeah,
Whereas if you're kind of working against that, and there's all these things saying like, no, you're kind of like, you're not on the right path. You're not on the right path.
there's
And
friction.
then, and yeah, if I was to define one of the great advantages an astrologer offers to people is the ability to say like, this is really the good path
Mm,
when
yeah,
asked, and does that require the gift of Hermes in your fortune or in your spirit, maybe.
Yeah. Well, Dorje, thank you so much for talking with me about this. I really, really appreciate it. Appreciate you sharing all your perspective and knowledge and experience.
Yeah, and thank you, SB. I mean, it's been a great pleasure, and I really look forward to seeing your works continue to evolve, because like you're off to just a great start with, and you have a great podcast. So I appreciate the invite to contribute to it for a few sentences. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. To support the show by donating or becoming a member, please visit my website, which is linked in the show notes. And please subscribe to the show wherever you listen. You can also find me on Instagram and Twitter. See those links in the show notes as well. If you have any questions or feedback on the show, please feel free to contact me via my website or email me at sphallhorary@gmail.com. In the show notes, you can also find links to astrologers and resources that we touched on in this episode. Thanks. See you next time.